Thank you so much, FA. It's really special to be able to present alongside such amazing scholars who are all doing rigorous academic work that advances social justice. So I'm really happy to be here and ready to go. So as FA mentioned, my project is about a movement called the Constitution Express. But I thought I might start by actually talking about the big birthday party Canada is throwing for itself this year. It's the 150th anniversary of Confederation, and as Canada gears up to celebrate, Indigenous people are making savvy interventions that expose the history of colonialism, like, for example, Cree artist Kent Monkman. In all of this, I've been thinking about ways that settler Canadians might reflect critically on our histories and the stories that give Canada meaning. And I've come to think of my project as another kind of intervention, one that recovers a different kind of resistant history about Canada and its relationship with Indigenous peoples. And I'm going to tell you just a bit of that story. So on November 24th, 1980, here in Vancouver, 2 trains were loaded up with flags, banners, drums, people and families, and left for Ottawa, destined to change the Constitution. This became known as the Constitution Express. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau had proposed to patriate the Constitution from the UK, to make it our own, and take a new step towards detaching ourselves from our colonial custodian. But this proposed patrioted Constitution made no mention of Indigenous peoples, no hint of Canada's relationship or obligations to them. So people started to worry that their rights would be extinguished by omission, by simply not being there, that their standing as treaty partners, as people with land rights that predate European arrival would disappear, and that the political partnerships that made Confederation possible would be quietly erased. And without their consent, they'd be tossed in as another minority within multiculturalism. So the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, with Grand Chief George Manuel as their president, chartered 2 trains to Ottawa. One took the northern route and the other went south before they joined up in Winnipeg. And as they gathered people along the way, they did workshops in popular education on nationhood and jurisdiction. By the time they reached Ottawa, the trains carried 1,000 people and a powerful vision for self-determination. They held conference, potlatch, and protested on Parliament Hill. Here's George Manuel at the helm. And for patriation to happen, they argued, a tripartite agreement should be reached between Canada, Indigenous peoples, and the UK on the political jurisdiction each should have. And then they went international. They launched a second campaign, the Constitution Express 2, that went to New York, where they presented at the UN, to London, where they launched a case in the British courts, and then elsewhere in Europe, where they drummed up really broad, widespread support. And this was at a time when Indigenous peoples were only just starting to organize at the international level. The Constitution Express 2 really propelled what was then sort of a budding transnational movement and helped to lay groundwork for the major advancements that we see today, like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Here in Canada, the movement was vital in getting Section 35 added to the Constitution, which recognized the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. Given that it changed the Constitution, it's shocking how little this story is known, how little attention it's had from academics, but also the public. I've heard it called the most effective direct action in Canadian history, but 35 years later, it's still a missing piece of history. And I came to know this story directly from those who were involved over about 7 years working with members of the Secwepemc Nation in Interior BC as a researcher, polyanalyst, and ally, where the movement's leader, George Manuel, is from, and his family of activists such as Arthur Manuel, who you just saw. They encouraged me to research this story with some urgency while some of its leaders are still alive to tell it. So really, this project, I think, was a public one before it was an academic one. The goal of my PhD is to document the movement and to draw public attention to it by collaborating on both academic and non-academic articles and even a documentary film. I'm working with living organizers of the movement to collect their oral histories and stories of it, and with support from the Public Scholars Initiative, I'm also able to facilitate group conversation circles with key organizations so that we can have more dynamic conversation about what went on. In all of this, I'll be guided by participants on how they'd like their stories represented. This is, after all, a story about Indigenous people's self-determination, so finding ways to honor that, honor their leadership in the research process itself, is my guiding methodology. But this project is not just about documenting an unrecorded story. It's also about the future. The relationship between settler Canada and Indigenous peoples remains unjust, and proposed solutions continue to fail. Why not look to the models that Indigenous peoples have been putting before us for more than 150 years? In movements like this one, the Constitution Express put forward a proposal, a political relationship based on mutual recognition and shared jurisdiction. And while Trudeau here celebrated the patriation with his famous pirouette, Indigenous peoples weren't so pleased. Their vision was not captured in Section 35. I often hear it called an empty box, leaving Indigenous peoples to negotiate for each right piece by piece, either in court, in modern treaties, or other negotiated agreements. As Millie Poplar, one of the key organizers of the movement, has said, we were fighting for nationhood, not Section 35. So my project is about exploring what it would mean, what it would look like if we were to take that vision as our content for Section 35 and see how that might guide us in building just political relations today. Recently, my mentor, Arthur Manuel, passed away. And I've been looking through old messages and things from him, and there was this one text message that I loved that made me laugh, where he just wrote, "Have a wonderful time decolonizing yourself." And I think he was teasing me, but on the other hand, I think he was also like sort of serious. This is work that we all have to do, Indigenous peoples and settlers alike. So coming up on this 150th birthday party, this is what I've been thinking about. My goal for this project is to contribute to this growing, resistant, resurging alternative history of Canada, one in which Indigenous and non-Indigenous people might see ourselves reflected and also see paths forward. So with the guidance of movements like the Constitution Express, I think we might all have the wonderful experience of decolonizing ourselves. Thank you.